My stepson ruined my marriage by making me the villain. Years later, he came begging for college funds. But I taught him a lesson he'll never forget. I used to think love could conquer anything, that patience and understanding could melt even the coldest hearts. Until I met a 12-year-old boy who turned my fairy-tale marriage into a 7-year nightmare. My name is Evelyn Harper, and I'm 41 years old. I work as a senior HR manager at a consulting firm, and I've always prided myself on being good with people, especially children. That confidence would prove to be my biggest mistake. I met David Moore at a charity fundraiser 3 years after his wife had passed away from cancer. The event was one of those elegant affairs where successful people gather to write checks and feel good about themselves. But David stood out from the crowd. He wasn't working the room like most of the other attendees. Instead, he was quietly studying the auction items with genuine interest, occasionally making notes in a small leather notebook. When I approached him near a display of children's artwork from a local shelter, he looked up with tired but kind eyes and made a self-deprecating joke about not understanding modern art. We spent the next hour talking about everything except the obvious. That we were both clearly single at an event full of couples. He was charming in an understated way, successful without being boastful, and there was something refreshingly honest about how he spoke about his life. David was 43, a civil engineer who specialized in sustainable building design. He'd been widowed for 3 years after his wife Sarah lost her battle with breast cancer, and he came with what I thought was just a small complication: a 12-year-old son named Brandon. When David spoke about Brandon, his entire demeanor changed. His shoulders relaxed, his smile became genuine, and his voice took on a warmth that made my chest tight with longing. "He's a bit shy but incredibly bright," David said, pulling out his phone to show me pictures. "Sometimes I think he's smarter than I am. He reads at a high school level and can beat me at chess 3 games out of 5. The photos showed a cute kid with messy brown hair and his father's green eyes, usually caught mid-laugh or concentrating intensely on some project. In every picture, Brandon looked like a normal, happy child who was lucky to have such a devoted father. David explained that he'd been completely focused on single parenting for the past 3 years, turning down social invitations and avoiding dating entirely. "I told myself Brandon needed me to be fully present," he said. "But honestly, I think I was hiding behind that excuse because I wasn't ready to risk getting hurt again." He paused, looking directly at me. "You're the first woman who's made me think maybe I'm ready to try." Our courtship was beautiful in all the ways that matter. David was attentive without being clingy, romantic without being over the top, and everything I'd been looking for in a partner after a series of disappointing relationships. He brought me flowers, not expensive arrangements, but small bouquets of my favorite daisies that he somehow remembered me mentioning. He planned thoughtful dates that showed he'd been listening to our conversations, like taking me to a small jazz club after I'd mentioned loving Miles Davis. What impressed me most was how seamlessly he balanced his role as a father with our growing relationship. He never made me feel like I was competing with Brandon for his attention, but he also never made Brandon feel like he was being replaced. When we went to dinner, David would always call to check in with Brandon, not because he was worried, but because he wanted his son to know he was thinking about him. When we spent weekends together, David would include Brandon in our plans, or make sure we had separate time so he could focus on his son. After 6 months of dating, David started including me in more activities with Brandon. We went to Brandon's baseball games, had family dinners at their house, and I even helped with a science project about renewable energy that played to both David's expertise and my organizational skills. Brandon seemed to warm up to me gradually, asking me questions about my work and laughing at my terrible jokes. I began to imagine myself as part of their little family, filling a role that had been empty for too long. When David proposed after 8 months of dating, he did it in their backyard while Brandon was at a sleepover, but he'd already talked to his son about it. "I wanted to make sure Brandon was comfortable with the idea before I asked you," he explained, as he got down on one knee next to the rose garden Sarah had planted before she died. "He said he thinks you make me smile more than I have in years, and that you make really good pancakes." The ring was perfect, simple, elegant, and clearly chosen by someone who'd been paying attention to my preferences. I said yes without hesitation, but even in that moment of pure joy, I felt a flutter of nervousness about becoming an instant mother to a 12-year-old who had already lost one mom. I pushed the feeling aside, telling myself that love and patience could overcome any challenge. The first red flag should have been Brandon's reaction when David told him our engagement was official. We'd planned a special dinner to celebrate, and I'd spent the afternoon making Brandon's favorite meal, spaghetti and meatballs with garlic bread. David had built up the moment all day, telling Brandon that we had exciting news to share and that this was going to be a night to remember. When we sat down to dinner, David took Brandon's hand in mine and announced with obvious joy, "Evelyn and I are getting married, which means we're going to be a real family." I was watching Brandon's face, expecting to see happiness, or at least acceptance, but instead, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Brandon looked directly at me with eyes that suddenly seemed much older than 12, and said in a voice dripping with disdain, "So you're the gold digger who's going to take all of Dad's money?" The words hit me like a physical slap. This wasn't a child repeating something he'd overheard without understanding. This was a deliberate, calculated insult delivered with perfect timing for maximum impact. David's reaction was almost worse than Brandon's words. He laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Brandon, buddy, you don't even know what that means. Someone at school must have said something silly." But I was still looking at Brandon, and the cold intelligence in his eyes told a different story. He knew exactly what he was saying, exactly how much it would hurt, and exactly how his father would respond. "I'm sorry," Brandon said, but his tone was flat, rehearsed. "I didn't mean anything by it." He looked down at his plate and began eating as if nothing had happened, while I sat there struggling to process what had just occurred. David squeezed my hand and gave me a look that clearly said, "Kids say the darndest things," but I felt like I'd just gotten a glimpse of something very dark lurking beneath the surface. That night, after Brandon had gone to bed, I tried to talk to David about the incident. "I don't think he was just repeating something he heard," I said carefully. "The way he looked at me when he said it." "Evelyn," David interrupted gently. "He's 12 years old. He's probably heard older kids talking about their parents' divorces or seen something on TV. He doesn't understand the implications of what he said." David pulled me close and kissed the top of my head. "He'll come around. He just needs time to adjust to the idea of having a mom again." I wanted to believe David was right, but something in my gut told me this wasn't going to be as simple as adjustment period. Still, I loved David, and I was committed to making this work. I decided to throw myself into building a relationship with Brandon, convinced that consistency and kindness would eventually win him over. I tried everything to connect with Brandon in the months leading up to the wedding. I bought him thoughtful gifts. Not expensive toys meant to buy his affection, but carefully chosen items that related to his interests. When he mentioned liking a particular book series, I bought him the entire collection. When he complained about his baseball glove being too small, I researched the best brands and got him a high-quality one that would last for years. Brandon accepted every gift with the same cold politeness. "Thank you," he would say in a tone that suggested I was a distant relative he barely knew. But it was what happened after that really told the story. I would find these gifts in the strangest places: the book shoved behind his dresser, the baseball glove left outside in the rain, the art supplies I'd bought him broken and scattered in his closet. When I discovered his brand new video game still in its wrapper in the kitchen trash can, I realized with a sick feeling that this wasn't carelessness or typical kid behavior. This was a systematic rejection of everything I tried to offer him. I pulled the game out of the garbage and confronted him about it. "Brandon, honey, why did you throw this away? I thought you wanted this game." He looked at me with those calculating eyes and shrugged. "I changed my mind. I don't really like video games anymore." But I had seen him playing games just the night before, and I knew he was lying. This wasn't about the gift. This was about sending me a message that nothing I offered would ever be good enough. I tried taking interest in his hobbies, showing up to every baseball game and cheering enthusiastically from the stands. I offered to help with homework, especially math where I actually had strong skills. I suggested fun activities we could do together, going to movies, visiting museums, teaching him to cook. Brandon's response was always the same: polite rejection delivered with just enough warmth that his father wouldn't notice the coldness underneath. The wedding was small and intimate, held in the garden behind David's house with just close family and friends in attendance. I had hoped that making Brandon a part of the ceremony would help him feel included rather than displaced. He was David's best man, and I wrote special vows that included promises to be the best stepmother I could be, and to honor the memory of his first mom. During the reception, I was floating on happiness. talking to guests about how excited I was to officially become Brandon's stepmom, and how much I was looking forward to building traditions as a family. I was mid-sentence, telling David's sister about my plans to help Brandon with his high school preparation, when Brandon appeared at our table like a small, well-dressed storm cloud. "She's not my mom," he announced loudly enough for half the reception to hear. The conversations around us died instantly. "My mom is dead, and this lady is just here for Dad's money." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the sprinkler system running in the neighbor's yard. I felt my face burn with embarrassment and hurt. But what came next was somehow worse. David didn't correct Brandon or discipline him. Instead, he pulled his son aside for what looked like a gentle, understanding conversation while I sat at our wedding reception feeling like I'd been publicly humiliated. When David returned, he squeezed my shoulder and said quietly, "He's just having a hard day. This is bringing up a lot of feelings about Sarah." But I had been watching Brandon during his conversation with his father, and he didn't look upset or emotional. He looked satisfied, like someone who had just accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do. Moving into David's house after our honeymoon felt like entering enemy territory, though it took me weeks to fully understand why. The house itself was beautiful, a craftsman-style home with original hardwood floors and built-in bookshelves that Sarah had filled with an eclectic mix of novels, cookbooks, and art books. David had kept everything exactly as it was when she died, which I understood and respected, but it also meant I was moving into a shrine to another woman. Brandon had lived in this house his entire life, and he made sure I understood that I was an intruder in his domain. It started small, things that could be explained away as accidents or forgetfulness. My coffee mug would disappear from the kitchen, only to turn up days later in the garage. My books would be moved from the nightstand to random locations around the house. My favorite pen would vanish from my purse and reappear in Brandon's backpack. When these incidents escalated to finding actual notes on my belongings, I knew I was dealing with something much more deliberate. "This doesn't belong here," written in Brandon's careful handwriting, appeared on my books, my coffee mug, even my toothbrush. The messages were always placed where David wouldn't see them, tucked inside book covers, taped to the bottom of my mug, slipped into my makeup bag. When I mentioned the notes to David, hoping he would finally see what was happening, he suggested that maybe Brandon was just having trouble sharing his space, and that I should try to be more understanding. "He's never had to share his home with anyone except me," David explained. "Maybe we can set up some clearer boundaries about which spaces are his and which are shared." But this wasn't about sharing space. This was about making me feel unwelcome in my own home, and it was about to get much, much worse. The psychological warfare escalated quickly once Brandon realized his father wasn't going to intervene. He developed a routine that was as predictable as it was devastating. Every morning, David would leave for work at 7:30, and by 8 o'clock, Brandon would find me wherever I was in the house and begin his daily campaign of emotional terrorism. "I hate you," he would say conversationally, as if he were commenting on the weather. "I hate that you're here, I hate that you married my dad, and I hate that you think you can replace my real mom." He would follow me from room to room, maintaining a calm, almost chatty tone while delivering the most hurtful words a child had ever spoken to me. He called me a gold digger, a homewrecker, a fake, and worse. He told me detailed stories about how much better his life was before I came along, how his father had been happier when it was just the two of them, and how everyone at school thought it was weird that his dad had married someone so much younger. He was smart enough never to do this when his father was around. And whenever I tried to tell David what was happening, Brandon would put on an innocent act that made me look like I was picking on a grieving child. "Evelyn seems really stressed lately," Brandon would say to his father with perfect concern in his voice. "I think maybe she's having trouble adjusting to being a stepmom. I've been trying to help her feel more comfortable, but she gets upset when I ask simple questions about stuff around the house." The gaslighting was so sophisticated that I began to question my own perceptions. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I was misreading normal childhood behavior as malicious. Maybe the stress of becoming an instant mother was making me paranoid. I started recording our conversations on my phone, thinking I could prove to David what was really happening. I felt terrible about secretly recording a child, but I was desperate to have some evidence that I wasn't losing my mind. But when I played the recordings back, I discovered something that chilled me to the bone. Brandon had somehow figured out that I might be recording him, and he had adapted his tactics accordingly. On the recordings, he sounded like a normal kid asking innocent questions about household rules or making casual observations about family dynamics. Meanwhile, my responses sounded defensive, harsh, and completely disproportionate to what he was saying. "Evelyn, why do you seem so angry all the time?" His recorded voice would ask with perfect childlike curiosity, while I responded with obvious frustration and suspicion. To anyone listening to these recordings, I sounded like an adult bullying a confused child, while Brandon sounded like a victim trying to understand why his new stepmother was treating him so badly. He had somehow mastered the art of psychological manipulation at 12 years old, and I was no match for his cunning. I realized with growing horror that this child had been planning my destruction from the moment his father announced our engagement, and he was executing his plan with the precision of someone much older and far more experienced in the art of deception. The breaking point should have been when I found my laptop in the swimming pool. Brandon claimed he'd been playing near the edge and accidentally knocked it in. The laptop contained months of work files and personal photos that weren't backed up. When I got upset, David accused me of caring more about material things than his son's feelings. That night, I heard Brandon laughing in his room while talking on the phone to a friend, saying, "You should have seen her face when she found it," but I stayed. I told myself that Brandon was just a hurt child acting out, that eventually my patience and love would win him over. I read parenting books, attended therapy sessions alone when David refused to come, and convinced myself that this was just a difficult phase that would pass. Years went by, Brandon grew taller, his voice changed, but his hatred for me never wavered. If anything, it intensified. He became more sophisticated in his attacks, learning to time his worst behavior for when David was stressed with work or dealing with his own grief. He would be the perfect son for weeks at a time, then unleash calculated cruelties that left me questioning my own sanity. When Brandon turned 16, I made the mistake of buying him a car for his birthday. I thought maybe a grand gesture would finally show him that I cared about him and wanted to be part of his life. He thanked me politely in front of David. Then later that night, he keyed the word fake into the paint on both sides. David's response when I showed him the damage was the moment I realized I would never win this battle. Instead of being angry at Brandon, he suggested that maybe someone at school had done it, or that Brandon might have been acting out because he felt pressured to like a gift he didn't want. He actually blamed me for putting Brandon in an uncomfortable position. The final straw came during Brandon's senior year of high school. I had taken a half-day off work to attend his school play, something I'd been doing for years despite his obvious resentment. When I arrived at the auditorium, I discovered that Brandon had given my ticket to his girlfriend's mother. When I asked him about it later, he smiled and said, "I figured you wouldn't really want to sit through something so boring anyway." That night, I made a decision that had been building for years. While David was asleep, I started planning my exit strategy. I opened a separate bank account, found an apartment across town, and quietly began moving my most precious belongings to storage. I was done being the villain in someone else's story. But before I could execute my plan, Brandon handed me the perfect opportunity to leave with my dignity intact. It was a Saturday morning in March. David had gone to play golf with his brother, and I was in the kitchen making breakfast when I heard my car starting in the driveway. I looked outside to see Brandon backing my Mercedes out of the garage. He was 17 and had a license, but he had never asked permission to use my car, and David and I had agreed that he needed to ask before borrowing either of our vehicles. I ran outside in my pajamas, but he was already pulling out of the driveway. I called his phone repeatedly, but he didn't answer. When I called David, he said Brandon was probably just running a quick errand and that I was overreacting. "He's almost 18, Evelyn. He can handle driving a car." 3 hours later, I got a call from the police. Brandon had been in an accident. He was fine, but my car was totaled, and he'd rear-ended a family of 4 at a red light. The other family was also uninjured, but their car was destroyed, and Brandon was cited for following too closely and driving without permission. When David and I arrived at the police station, Brandon immediately launched into a story about how I had given him permission to take the car, but had forgotten because I'd been drinking wine the night before. He tearfully told the officers that he was sorry for misunderstanding, and that he thought I'd said it was okay since I'd been acting strange lately. I stared at this 17-year-old boy, watching him lie to police officers with the same ease that he'd been lying to his father for years. The officers looked at me with suspicion, and I realized that even they believed Brandon's story over mine. David didn't say a word in my defense. Not one word. The insurance company refused to cover the damages because Brandon wasn't listed on my policy and hadn't had permission to drive the car. I was looking at nearly $40,000 in damages between my car and the other family's vehicle. When I explained to David that Brandon would need to take responsibility for this, both financially and legally, David suggested that we handle it as a family and that making Brandon pay would ruin his future. That evening, as I sat in our living room calculating how I could possibly afford to cover Brandon's mistake, I overheard him on the phone with a friend. "You should have seen the look on her face," he was saying. "She actually thought my dad would choose her over me. It's like she doesn't understand that I'm his real family, and she's just some random woman who happened to stick around long enough." That's when I realized that this had never been about grief or adjustment, or a child acting out. This had been a calculated 7-year campaign to make me so miserable that I would leave on my own. Brandon had been waiting for me to break, and he'd finally found the perfect way to do it. I didn't confront either of them that night. Instead, I went upstairs, opened my laptop, and began researching divorce attorneys. By Monday morning, I had retained the best family lawyer in the city and started the process of documenting every incident, every financial contribution I'd made to the household, and every attempt David had made to gaslight me into believing I was the problem. The divorce was swift and decisive. I had kept meticulous records of everything: the property damage, the emotional manipulation, the financial contributions I'd made to Brandon's expenses over the years. David was shocked when I presented evidence that I'd been paying for nearly 60% of Brandon's costs, including his car insurance, school fees, and medical expenses. When David tried to negotiate for alimony, my lawyer pointed out that I actually out-earned him by 30%, and that I'd been subsidizing their lifestyle for years. The house had been David's before our marriage, so I had no claim to it, but I also had no responsibility for the mortgage or Brandon's ongoing expenses. The day I moved out, Brandon was at school. I left a single note on his nightstand: "You won. I hope it was worth it." I didn't hear from either of them for 7 years. I rebuilt my life piece by piece. I got a promotion at work, moved to a beautiful apartment downtown, traveled to places I'd always wanted to see, and reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage. I started therapy and learned to recognize manipulation tactics that I'd missed for years. I dated occasionally but wasn't in a hurry to remarry. I'd learned the value of my own company. Then, last month, I received a message on LinkedIn that made my blood pressure spike. It was from Brandon Moore, now 24 years old, with a profile picture that showed a young man who looked remarkably like his father. "Hi Evelyn," the message read. "I hope you're doing well. I know it's been a long time since we've spoken, but I wanted to reach out because I'm applying to graduate school and could really use some financial help. I'm trying to get into a master's program in communications, but student loans won't cover everything. I remember you always said education was important, and I was hoping you might be willing to help me out. I promise I'll pay you back once I'm working in my field. Thanks for considering it. Brandon." I stared at the message for a full 5 minutes, reading it over and over again. The audacity was breathtaking. After years of calling me a gold digger, after systematically destroying my marriage to his father, after celebrating my departure from their lives, he was asking me for money. I crafted my response carefully. "Dear Brandon, thank you for reaching out. I have to admit, I'm surprised to hear from you after all these years, especially since the last words you ever said to me were good riddance when I moved out. I'm curious, why would you ask a gold digger for money? I distinctly remember you telling me many times that I was only interested in your father's finances, not in building genuine relationships. If that was true, why would you think I'd be willing to invest in your education now? I also remember you telling the police that I was irresponsible and untrustworthy. Would it really be wise to accept money from someone you described as having such poor judgment? I hope you can understand why I find your request confusing, given our history. I'm sure someone as resourceful as you will find another way to fund your education. Best of luck with your future endeavors. Evelyn." I hit send before I could second-guess myself. His response came within an hour. "Look, I know we didn't get along when I was younger, but I was just a kid dealing with a lot of stuff. My mom died and it was hard having someone new in the house. I'm sure you can understand that. I'm not asking for charity, I said I'd pay you back. Dad thought you might be willing to help since you always talked about wanting to be part of the family. The manipulation was still there, just more polished now. He was minimizing his behavior as normal childhood adjustment, while simultaneously trying to guilt me with his mother's death and his father's suggestion. But what struck me most was that he still couldn't bring himself to apologize. I wrote back, Brandon, I appreciate your explanation, but I think there may be some confusion about our past relationship. What you describe as not getting along included years of deliberate psychological torment, property destruction, and ultimately insurance fraud when you took my car without permission and then lied to police about it. If your father suggested I might help you financially, perhaps he forgot to mention that your behavior was the primary reason our marriage ended. I spent 7 years trying to build a relationship with you, during which time I contributed over $150,000 to your expenses, education, and activities. Your response was to call me a gold digger and celebrate when I finally left. I'm not interested in relitigating the past, but I'm also not interested in funding the future of someone who worked so hard to remove me from his life. I suggest you ask the people who actually matter to you for support. Evelyn, what came next was exactly what I expected. A phone call from David. Evelyn, please. His voice sounded older, more tired than I remembered. I know things ended badly between us, but Brandon really needs help. He's a good kid who made some mistakes when he was younger. Some mistakes? I laughed, and I could hear the bitterness in my own voice. David, he systematically destroyed our marriage while you stood by and let it happen. He committed insurance fraud and made me pay for it. Those weren't mistakes, they were choices. He was grieving his mother. He was 12 when we met, David. He was 19 when I left. At what point does grief become responsibility for his actions? There was a long pause. Look, I know I didn't handle things well. I should have set better boundaries, should have made him treat you with respect. I was trying to protect him, but I realize now that I failed you both. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever received from David, but it was 7 years too late. I appreciate you saying that, I said, but acknowledgement doesn't change what happened. You chose to believe Brandon's lies over my truth repeatedly. You allowed him to destroy my property and then blamed me for being upset about it. You enabled his behavior until I had no choice but to leave. So you won't help him? David, Brandon spent 7 years making it crystal clear that I wasn't his family and never would be. He got exactly what he wanted, me out of his life. I don't understand why he would want help from someone he worked so hard to get rid of. Because you're successful now and we're struggling. The honesty was jarring. So I'm good enough to ask for money, just not good enough to be treated with basic human decency? It's not like that. It's exactly like that. When Brandon needed someone to blame and torment, I was the perfect target. Now that he needs money, suddenly I'm family again? I'm not a bank, David. I'm a person who deserved better from both of you. I hung up before he could respond. Over the next few weeks, I received several more messages from Brandon, each one more desperate than the last. He tried different approaches, claiming he'd learned from his mistakes, promising to make things right between us, even suggesting that helping him would be the Christian thing to do. When emotional manipulation didn't work, he tried practical arguments about investment in his future and guaranteed returns. Finally, I sent one last message, Brandon, I need you to understand something fundamental. I don't owe you anything. Not my time, not my money, not my forgiveness, and certainly not my help. You made a choice when you were 12 years old to treat me as an enemy instead of someone who wanted to love you. You continued making that choice every day for 7 years. You celebrated when I left your life, and now you want back in only because you need something. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not hurt anymore. I'm simply done. You taught me that not everyone deserves my kindness, and that lesson has served me well. I hope you find another way to fund your education. I'm sure someone as creative as you will figure something out. Don't contact me again. Evelyn. I blocked both Brandon and David on all platforms and felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized was still there. Today, as I sit in my corner office overlooking the city, I think about the woman I was 7 years ago. Desperate to be loved and accepted, willing to sacrifice my own peace for the illusion of family. That woman would have probably sent Brandon money, convinced herself that helping him was the right thing to do, that maybe this time would be different. But I'm not that woman anymore. I've learned that love shouldn't require you to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. I've learned that family isn't about blood or marriage certificates. It's about mutual respect, support, and genuine care for each other's well-being. I have a small circle of friends who value me, colleagues who respect my work, and a life that belongs entirely to me. I answer to no one, apologize for nothing I didn't actually do, and sleep peacefully knowing that I'm not walking on eggshells in my own home. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not having children of my own, if I wish I'd tried harder with Brandon, if I miss being married. The answer is simple. I regret nothing about my current life. I spent 7 years trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worthy of it. Now I spend my energy on people who appreciate what I bring to their lives. And the difference is extraordinary. Brandon taught me the most valuable lesson of my adult life. Not everyone deserves access to your heart, your home, or your bank account. Some people see kindness as weakness and generosity as opportunity. Learning to recognize those people and protect yourself from them isn't cynical, it's wisdom. The sun is setting outside my office window, casting golden light across my desk, where photos of friends, travels, and achievements remind me of the life I've built from the ashes of my failed marriage. Tomorrow I'm flying to Italy for a photography workshop, something I never could have done when I was married. Between Brandon's constant emergencies and David's guilt trips about leaving them, I raise my coffee cup in a silent toast to the woman I used to be and the woman I've become. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting free. And I am finally, completely, beautifully free.